Think about those stories that just seem to echo through time, the ones that people keep telling and retelling. It's
Yeah,
like they tap into something really fundamental about what it means to be human.
absolutely. They become more than just old tales. They offer frameworks, for understanding ourselves and the world around us, even centuries later.
And that's exactly the kind of connection we're digging into today. One of you sent in a fascinating request to explore the relationship between Jesus' parable of the prodigal son and the much older story in the Old Testament of Jacob and Esau.
Right. And for this deep dive, we've been looking at some really insightful material, particularly the work of Kenneth Bailey, alongside other scholarly perspectives that have noticed how Luke's gospel seems to weave in threads from Genesis.
Okay, so our goal here is to really understand why Jesus might have drawn on this ancient family conflict when he told his parable.
Mm-hmm.
What can we learn by looking at these deliberate echoes between the two stories, especially when it comes to things like, family, inheritance, that feeling of being lost and then found?
Yeah. And grace.
And grace and
Yep.
starting over, yeah.
It's so important to remember that Jesus's original audience they would have grown up hearing the story of Jacob and Esau. These weren't just minor characters; they were central, to their history and identity.
Right.
So any parallels Jesus drew wouldn't have been subtle; they would have resonated like really deeply.
Okay, so how do these two stories even begin to mirror each other? What are the basic similarities that jump out first?
Well, at the most fundamental level, both present a story about a father and his two sons.
Okay.
And these sons are in some kind of struggle, some conflict related to what they're going to inherit and their place within the family. That's the initial broad connection that sort of sets the stage.
Right, that core of family drama seems to be the starting point.
Yeah.
And it sounds like scholars like Kenneth Bailey have really gone into the nitty-gritty of these connections. What specific details are we talking about?
Yeah, Bailey points to a number of key structural similarities. So in both stories, you have a younger and an elder son who experience a break, some kind of break in their relationship with their father.
Hmm.
And a central point of tension in both is definitely the inheritance. We then see the younger son in each narrative making a clean break, essentially,
Yeah.
and heading off to a distant land,
Right, leaving home.
while the elder son stays behind with the father. So that basic structure is there.
So it's not just a general feeling of similarity. There's some pretty specific plot points that line up. But when we really look closely at the texts themselves, are there even like deeper connections?
Oh, absolutely. When you examine the actual words and actions described, the parallels become quite remarkable, really.
Like what?
Think about the younger son's initial behavior. In both accounts, there's a sense of defiance towards the father. Jacob's deception of Isaac. That's a clear act of undermining his father's wishes, right?
Hmm.
And the prodigal's demand for his share and the way he just squanders it shows a similar disrespect. Then, when things go wrong, both experience a moment of humbling before they return.
Ah, okay.
Jacob is terrified of what Esau might do.
Right, he sends gifts ahead.
Exactly. And the prodigal fears his father's potential anger. He's rehearsing his apology.
That sense of dread before facing the father figure seems really significant. And what about the father's reaction? That's such a powerful image in the parable.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The language used to describe the father's embrace in both stories is incredibly similar. Genesis 33 tells us that Esau ran to meet Jacob and kissed him.
Yeah.
Now listen to Luke 15. The father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him.
Wow. Scholars
Scholars have pointed out this near identical phrasing. It's almost a direct echo across these two ancient texts. It suggested a very deliberate link that, Jesus's audience would likely have picked up on immediately.
Wow, that almost word-for-word similarity is striking. It's hard to imagine that's just a coincidence.
It really is.
So beyond these specific actions and words, what bigger ideas or themes are emphasized by this connection between the Jacob story and the parable?
Well, the themes of leaving home and then returning become really central. Exile and homecoming.
Mm.
Both Jacob's flight from Esau and the prodigal's journey to a faraway country represent a kind of exile, right?
Mm.
A separation from family, security, their familiar life.
Yeah.
Their eventual return and the way they are received really highlight that deep human desire for belonging and for things to be made right. Reconciliation.
It sounds like Jesus is doing more than just retelling an old story with a slight twist, though.
Hmm.
Our sources mention some deliberate differences in the details. Why do those changes matter?
Precisely. These intentional changes or inversions actually serve really important theological purposes.
Okay, like what?
For example, in Genesis, Jacob tries to smooth things over with Esau by offering him gifts. He's trying to placate him.
Right.
In the parable, it's the father who proactively showers the returning prodigal with gifts, the special ring, the best clothes, the sandals.
He doesn't wait.
He doesn't wait. And this act of bestowing honor essentially elevates the younger son, sort of symbolically supplanting the elder brother, you could say. It inverts Jacob's earlier act of taking Esau's blessing.
So the roles are almost flipped in a way. The one who took something in the original story is now being surpassed, in a sense, by the one who comes back with nothing.
Exactly. And think about this other detail. Esau was in the field when Jacob received Isaac's blessing back in Genesis 27.
I remember that.
The parable mirrors this detail by having the elder brother also in the field when the younger son returns home and the party starts. These aren't just random details. They seem carefully placed to draw specific parallels and also, importantly, to highlight some key contrasts in the meaning.
This idea of the family being broken apart seems to be a key element in both stories.
Yeah.
How does this estrangement play out in each?
Well, in Genesis, the break is quite dramatic. Jacob's deception to get Isaac's blessing ignites a real fury in Esau, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, he wants to kill him.
Right. To the point where Jacob has to run for his life. Years later, they do have that meeting and a form of reconciliation, but it's interesting to note that it's limited.
Limited how?
They accept each other's apology. Esau refuses most of the gifts initially. They embrace.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they choose to live separately. They go their separate ways.
Right, they don't reunite as one family unit.
No, and even their descendants end up in different territories, often in conflict.
So there's a resolution, but not a complete coming back together. How does that compare to what happens in the parable?
The parable presents a really powerful contrast here. The moment the younger son even starts heading home, the father sees him.
Runs to him.
Runs to him. There's a full and immediate restoration with the father. The father doesn't wait for a rehearsed speech or anything. He takes the lead, running towards his son, embracing him, giving him symbols of honor, throwing a big celebration.
All without conditions.
All without any conditions. It really emphasizes the father's overwhelming desire for complete reconciliation, for bringing the son fully back into the family.
It's fascinating that our source material points out that the parable actually suggests that both brothers' estrangement from the father is seen as, well, equally problematic. That's not something you necessarily pick up on in a casual reading.
That's a really important insight that Kenneth Bailey emphasizes. He argues that both sons, in their own way, displayed a deep lack of respect for their father and what he represented, the inheritance.
Both of them. How so?
Well, Bailey suggests that by demanding their inheritance early, the younger one explicitly, the older one maybe implicitly through his attitude, both were essentially acting as if they wished their father were already gone. It's quite a stark reading.
That's a pretty strong statement. What in the text leads to that interpretation, especially for the older son?
Bailey draws a compelling parallel between Jacob's complaint to Laban in Genesis 31, about years of hard work without proper compensation or getting his wife.
Right. What is my offense?
Exactly. He compares that speech to the elder brother's bitter words to his father in Luke 15. Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me even a young goat.
Ah, the language is similar. That sense of grievance.
Yes. The language they use to express their frustration, their sense of being wronged despite their service, has a striking similarity. Bailey argues this blurring of the lines between the obviously wayward son and the seemingly dutiful one suggests that both harbored a similar sense of entitlement and resentment towards their father, an estranged attitude.
So it's not just the son who ran off who's distant. The one who stayed home has his own, maybe more subtle issues with the father-son relationship.
Exactly. And yet the father in Jesus' parable doesn't give up on either of them. He actively tries to bridge that gap with both.
We see him run to the younger son.
Yes. And even when the elder son is outside, sulking, refusing to join the celebration, the father goes out to him. He pleads with him.
He goes out to meet him too.
He does. This really reframes the parable as a story about the father's relentless pursuit of reconciliation with both his children, no matter how different their paths of estrangement have been. It's a drama of reconciliation, as Bailey calls it.
So Jesus isn't just telling a feel-good story about a lost kid finding his way home. He's using this familiar framework of Jacob and Esau to communicate a much deeper theological truth.
Yeah.
What's the core message there, according to the sources?
Well, one of the key aspects is how Jesus flips traditional expectations. In the Old Testament, the blessing from Isaac was incredibly significant, right?
Yeah.
It determined status and inheritance within the family who was in.
Hugely significant.
In the parable, that sense of earned privilege or even privilege gained through deception like Jacob is transformed into a freely given gift of grace from the Father. It's not earned.
And the younger brother.
The younger brother, who in the Jacob story is often seen as, well, maybe a bit of a schemer, someone who takes advantage.
Yeah.
He becomes the surprising hero of the parable. Someone who, as our source puts it, is saved by sheer grace alone, despite his clearly abusive behavior and poor choices.
That would have been pretty unexpected, even shocking for Jesus' Jewish listeners, wouldn't it? To see Jacob, a foundational figure in their history, portrayed in this way as the model for the prodigal.
Absolutely. The implication was quite radical. God's favor, God's blessing, isn't limited to those who seem to deserve it based on their actions or lineage. It extends even to those who appear to be the least worthy.
And the flip side.
And conversely, those who pride themselves on their own righteousness, like the elder brother mirroring perhaps some aspects of Esau's perceived entitlement or later resentment, are shown to be in need of a change of heart, of repentance as well.
And this reframing also strongly aligns Jesus himself with the compassionate father figure in the parable.
Yes, the sources suggest that. Jesus embodies both the shepherd actively searching for the lost sheep and the overjoyed father welcoming his son back in the broader context of Luke 15. His actions mirrored the father's compassion.
The source mentions this idea of costly love being poured out on the returning son. How does that relate back to the story of Jacob? Is there a parallel there too?
Well, just as the father in the parable lavishly gives gifts and celebration to the prodigal, the commentary draws a parallel to how God extends grace to Jacob in Genesis, even after Jacob's questionable actions. Think about Esau's eventual willingness to reconcile, Jacob's survival and subsequent prosperity. These can be seen as examples of God's unmerited favor, God's grace, despite Jacob's past.
Okay. And the elder son's reaction.
And the bitterness of the elder son in the parable directly mirrors the attitudes of the scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders of Jesus' time who criticized him for associating with tax collectors and sinners, those they deemed unworthy.
So the parable isn't just about an individual's repentance. It's also making a statement about who gets to be part of God's family, God's kingdom, and how that inclusion happens.
Precisely. The parable effectively announces the ultimate authority figure, the Father, who in this context, effectively represents Jesus' own mission and view of God, offers forgiveness and the full inheritance of God's promises to anyone who humbles themselves and turns back.
And that line, the father says to the elder son.
Yes. Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. This is presented not just as a rebuke, but as a profoundly inclusive statement about who can share in God's covenant inheritance. It's an open invitation, even to the resentful one.
By using Jacob as this example of someone who repents, or at least receives grace, Jesus is essentially reinterpreting Israel's own story, isn't he? He's recasting their patriarch.
Exactly. He's taking Jacob, the namesake of their nation, who might have been viewed as a flawed but ultimately chosen and successful ancestor, and presenting him as a prime example of someone who was saved not because of his own merits or cunning, but because of God's grace.
So national family squabble.
The national family squabble between Jacob and Esau then becomes a universal illustration, a model of how God's mercy can overcome human sin and division.
So this isn't just a comforting story. It's actually a challenge to how Jesus' listeners understood their own identity and their relationship with God.
That's right. Bailey calls it a freshly created, identity-forming story. It's meant to shape how they see themselves. In this new story, those who recognize their need for forgiveness, the Jacob types, the prodigals, are welcomed back fully.
And the others.
And those who are confident in their own righteousness, perhaps like the elder brother, or maybe even Esau in some interpretations of the self-assured, they are challenged to examine their own hearts, their own potential estrangement. The focus shifts dramatically to God's mercy, the offer of second chances, and the overwhelming power of grace.
And our source material also places this parable within the context of the three lost and found stories in Luke 15. How does the Jacob narrative fit into that broader picture? Why tell these three together?
Yeah, Luke deliberately groups the parable of the prodigal son, or maybe we should call it the lost son, with the parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin.
Right.
And the clear theme is God's incredible joy, the celebration in heaven when something that's lost is found. Bailey argues that these three stories are sophisticated, deeply interconnected, designed for an audience very familiar with the Hebrew scriptures.
Okay.
In each one, you see both those who were lost and then found, and crucially, those who, thinking they are secure, completely miss the point of the celebration.
So the 99 sheep and the 9 coins represent one group. The single lost sheep, lost coin, and younger son represent another. Is that the idea?
Precisely. The larger numbers, the 99 sheep safe in the fold, the 9 coins not lost, symbolize those who, like the Pharisees and scribes listening, assume they were already in, already righteous, already found.
Okay.
The single lost items and the younger son represent those who were clearly on the outside, the tax collectors, the sinners that Jesus was spending time with, the ones everyone agreed were lost.
And the connection to Jacob.
The underlying message, connecting back to Jacob, is that every Israelite, much like their patriarch Jacob, is ultimately dependent on God's grace to be truly found and restored. No one is secure just by default.
And the story of Jacob itself embodies this theme of being lost and then found, doesn't it?
Yeah.
His whole life story.
Absolutely. Jacob's separation from his family, his exile, his time away working for Laban, his eventual return, and even that mysterious wrestling with God at Peniel, it can all be seen as foreshadowing this journey of repentance, struggle, and restoration by grace.
So by drawing this parallel with Jacob, Jesus is subtly suggesting that the nation of Israel itself perhaps has strayed.
Yes, that's the implication, that Israel is in need of returning, of repentance, and that God, like the Father, is running to welcome them back.
And the feast.
The Father's celebratory feast for the prodigal mirrors God's joy described in the other lost parables, and the elder brother's resentment, his sourness outside the party. It echoes perhaps Esau's initial anger or pride, and definitely mirrors the Pharisees' reaction. Both represent insiders who struggle with the radical inclusiveness of God's mercy, who can't quite join the celebration for those they deem unworthy.
It really all comes back to this central idea of God's almost scandalous unlimited grace, doesn't it?
Exactly. Bailey sums it up well. The lost sheep, coin, and son symbolize the sinners whom Jesus welcomes. The 99 sheep, the 9 coins, and the older son represent those self-righteous individuals who fail to recognize their own need for that same grace, their own lostness in a way.
By weaving the Jacob-Esau story into this framework, Jesus broadens the message.
He does. What began as a specific story about one family, Israel's founding family, becomes a pattern for the journey of every person who turns back to God, regardless of their background.
So to tie it all together then, Jesus is using this incredibly familiar story of Jacob and Esau not just to illustrate a point, but to fundamentally reshape how his audience understood their history, their identity, and their relationship with God.
Precisely. He's using those well-known elements, the two sons, the father figure, the inheritance conflict, the leaving, the coming back, the embraces, the feasts. But he's using them to deliver a profound theological message.
A reinterpretation?
A radical reinterpretation. Jacob, once seen perhaps as the somewhat flawed but chosen ancestor, becomes the symbol of the sinner saved purely by grace. And Esau, or at least the elder brother figure reflecting some aspects, embodies the self-assured who might tragically miss the open invitation to the party.
And the Father's love.
The Father's love in this new telling clearly prioritizes the mending of broken relationships, the restoration of the lost, above all else, above social status, above merit, above keeping score.
Our source material even quotes a scholar concluding that Jesus offers significant variations on the parent worldview, essentially presenting himself and the God he represents as the true Father of reconciliation.
Yes, and in doing so, the parable becomes, as Bailey suggests, a new identity story for those who follow Jesus. It's a story where God is revealed as the Father of prodigals, the Father who runs to meet us, and where that generous, unearned forgiveness becomes the true inheritance of every child who returns to him.
So the core takeaway here, what you really want to leave listeners with, is that Jesus masterfully took a story his audience knew intimately, inside and out, and wove it into his teaching to illuminate these profound truths about grace, repentance, and God's incredible, maybe even shocking love for both those who have clearly lost their way and those who think they have everything under control.
Exactly. By understanding these echoes, these deliberate connections to the Jacob and Esau story, we gain a much richer and deeper understanding of the revolutionary message at the heart of the Prodigal Son parable. It's not just a simple tale.
This has been a truly illuminating deep dive. It really makes you appreciate how these ancient narratives continue to offer such profound insights, layers upon layers.
Hmm.
For you listening, maybe think about which character in these interwoven stories, Jacob, Esau, the younger son, the older son, even the father, resonates most with you right now. What might that tell you about your own understanding or maybe your own experience of grace and reconciliation?
It's a great question. It really invites us to consider the lasting power of these ancient stories to shape not only how we understand the divine, but also how we see ourselves and, importantly, our relationships with each other, still so relevant.
And as always, it feels like there are always deeper layers to uncover in the stories that shape us. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.